If you're joining us today, you're likely a dedicated learner.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you're a medical student deep in your epidemiology modules, or a junior doctor trying to make sense of population health metrics.
Right.
Or maybe you're a public health trainee reading along with the Oxford textbook of global public health.
Yeah, that's the one.
Today, we are serving as your active reading companion guide. We're going to take a conceptual deep dive into the underlying architecture of public health.
Exactly.
And the mission for this session is to figure out exactly how public health as a discipline identifies and responds to threats.
Yeah, and we're going to examine this first on the microscopic individual level, and then we're going to zoom all the way out to the international geopolitical scale.
To tie all this together, we really need an overarching conceptual model.
We do.
Yeah.
And as you read through the textbook, I want you to visualize a planetary defense grid.
Ooh, I like that.
Think of public health as this massive, multi-layered radar system.
Uh-huh.
The first layer is the internal radar. That's population screening. It's the mechanism we use to sweep the internal environment of the human body, looking for invisible, silent risks before they crash the biological system.
Right, because we spent so much time in medical training focusing on treating the sick patient right in front of us.
Exactly.
But this internal radar is entirely different. And once we get a handle on that, we're going to transition to the second layer, which is the global radar.
The international health governance side.
Yeah, because transboundary threats, things like a mutating virus or a contaminated food supply chain or, an environmental toxin,
Right.
they operate a lot like airplanes.
They cross borders constantly.
Right. But the difference is a virus doesn't pause at customs to ask for permission.
No, it doesn't.
So managing that kind of threat requires incredibly complex, negotiated international cooperation.
So we're going to start by unpacking the paradoxes of population screening. You'll find this in Chapter 11.4 of the textbook.
Okay.
We need to build a solid framework for how we measure risk, intervention, and the ultimate impact on the healthcare system.
And then once we have that foundation, we'll shift over to Chapter 3.8.
Right, where we explore international efforts to promote public health, dissecting the hard treaties and the soft laws that actually keep this global radar spinning.
Let's start with Part 1, that internal radar. Let's look at the philosophy and the sheer mechanics of population screening.
Let's do it.
I want to challenge a concept that feels almost universally accepted. If you ask the general public, or honestly, if you ask most junior clinicians on their very first day on the wards, there's this unwritten golden rule.
Catching disease early is always good.
Yes, catching disease early is always a good thing. It just feels intuitively correct. You find the cancer early, you cut it out, you cure the patient.
Right.
But the textbook goes to great lengths to tear that assumption down. It calls this the illusion of simplicity. Why is it an illusion?
Well, it's an illusion because it fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the clinical encounter in a screening context.
How so?
Think about standard clinical medicine. A patient comes into your clinic because they have a symptom.
Right, they have a lump or a cough or pain.
Exactly.
Right.
They are actively seeking your help because their baseline health has been disrupted. Screening flips that dynamic completely on its head.
Because we're going to them.
Right. In a screening program, the healthcare provider is the one initiating the contact. We are actively approaching healthy, asymptomatic people.
Yeah.
We're knocking on their doors, sending them letters, and offering them a medical intervention they didn't ask for.
Which completely changes the ethical landscape.
Completely.
I mean, if someone comes to me in the emergency department with severe abdominal pain, the risk of doing a CT scan is justified by their immediate suffering.
Of course.
But if I send a letter to 10,000 perfectly healthy people asking them to come in for a scan,
Yeah.
my threshold for causing harm has to be practically zero.
Precisely. Because you are making the first move, the ethical bar you have to clear is monumental. If you run tests on tens of thousands of healthy individuals, statistical errors aren't just a vague possibility.
They're guaranteed.
They are an absolute certainty. This is where we have to apply a strict systems framework. Risk leading to intervention, leading to system impact. We have to ruthlessly calculate the harm caused by false positives.
Let's break down that harm. From a clinical perspective, if a screening test incorrectly flags a healthy person as having a disease, you've just instantly manufactured anxiety.
Oh, massive anxiety.
You might stigmatize them in their community or their family. But from a systems perspective, the damage is even wider, isn't it?
Much wider. You're draining massive resources. That false positive now requires a confirmatory test. Maybe a surgical biopsy, specialized pathology reviews, clinical consultations, all for a patient who is perfectly healthy to begin with.
And we can't ignore the other side of the statistical coin, either the false negatives.
Right. A false negative provides a highly dangerous sense of false reassurance.
So a patient might notice a legitimate worrying symptom a year later, but they ignore it.
Yeah, they think, well, my screening test was totally clear last year, so it can't be anything serious. This level of inherent risk is why epidemiologists strictly differentiate between true population screening and other forms of testing.
I want to make sure we nail down that differentiation because it's a classic trap in exams and just in practice generally.
Okay, let's test it.
If I'm working in a primary care clinic and I have a known diabetic patient sitting in front of me and I check their eyes for diabetic retinopathy, is that population screening?
No, it's not. That falls under clinical management or targeted case finding.
Because they're already in the system.
Exactly. That patient is already integrated into the healthcare system with a known, documented risk factor. They aren't the general, unselected public.
Okay, what if a patient comes into the emergency department with a broken ankle, and while they're there, I opportunistically offer them an HIV swab or a hepatitis C test?
That is opportunistic testing.
Not screening.
No. Again, it's not true screening because you're utilizing an existing healthcare encounter.
So what makes it true screening?
True population screening is a systematic, highly organized public health program. It's the government or a national health body actively inviting every single woman between the ages of 50 and 70 in a specific region to come in for a mammogram.
Got it. It's proactive and systematic on a population level.
Yes. And that fundamental difference dictates the level of rigorous, exhaustive evaluation that has to happen before the program is ever given the green light.
Which brings us to the mathematical engine of screening.
Yes.
If the risks of testing healthy people are so high, how does a public health body actually decide if a test is good enough to roll out to millions of people?
We rely on a set of standards that have been evolving for decades. The foundation was laid by the Wilson and Jungner criteria.
Right, published way back in 1968 for the World Health Organization.
Exactly. And these have since been refined by organizations like the UK National Screening Committee.
What do these criteria actually demand?
Several things before a program can start. First, the condition has to be an important health problem.
Makes sense.
Second, we have to thoroughly understand its natural history, meaning we know what happens if we just leave it alone.
And there must be an effective, acceptable treatment available, right?
Yes. It makes no sense to screen for a disease if we have no way to treat it.
You're just giving someone a death sentence years earlier than necessary.
Precisely. But the most mathematically challenging criterion is that there must be a simple, safe, precise, and validated screening test.
And here is where so many ambitious screening programs fail.
Because you cannot simply evaluate the efficacy of your test in a hospital setting and then assume it will work in the general population.
I really want to slow down here and map this out. This is where clinical intuition violently clashes with epidemiological reality.
It really does.
If a specialized research hospital develops a brilliant new blood test for a specific type of cancer, the patients they use to validate that test are likely already in the oncology ward.
Right. That's a high prevalence setting. A huge percentage of the people they're testing actually have the disease.
But a public screening program operates in the general public,
Which is a low prevalence setting. And this is where we need to dive deeply into the concept of specificity versus sensitivity.
Okay, let's unpack those. If you ask a frontline clinician what makes a good test, they almost always default to sensitivity.
Always. Sensitivity is the ability of a test to correctly identify those who truly have the disease.
The clinical mindset is terrified of missing a diagnosis. The mandate is don't miss a case.
So they push for tests with 99% or ideally 100% sensitivity.
But in the world of population screening,
Specificity is frequently the far more critical metric. Specificity is the ability of the test to correctly identify those without the disease.
to understand why specificity reigns supreme in public health, we have to do some math.
Let's do it.
We need to talk about positive predictive value, or PPV. For you listening, if you're looking at screening data, PPV is arguably the most important number on the page.
It absolutely is. PPV answers the ultimate patient question. Doc, my screening test came back positive. What are the actual chances that I have the disease?
Let's walk through a hypothetical scenario to prove why sensitivity isn't enough.
Okay, let's set up the parameters. Imagine we are screening for a rare condition. Let's say the prevalence in our target population is 0.1%.
So 1 in 1,000 people actually have the disease.
Right. Now, let's say a laboratory hands you what looks like a miraculous screening test. It has 95% sensitivity and 95% specificity.
Most people would look at those numbers and think, fantastic, let's roll it out.
They would. So let's act as the public health planner here. You're rolling this test out to 10,000 asymptomatic people in your city.
Okay, so based on our 0.1% prevalence, out of those 10,000 people, only 10 actually have the disease.
Right. The other 9,990 people are perfectly healthy.
Okay.
Let's look at your 10 sick patients first. Your test has 95% sensitivity. That means it's going to correctly identify 95% of the people who actually have the disease.
So 95% of 10 is 9.5. Let's say we catch 9 or 10 of them.
That's your pool of true positives. You didn't miss many cases. The clinicians are happy.
But wait, let's look at the healthy population. I have 9,990 perfectly healthy people taking this test. The test has a specificity of 95%.
Right.
That means it correctly identifies 95% of those healthy people as negative. That's great. But it also means it incorrectly flags 5% of them as positive.
And what is 5% of 9,990?
Oh, wow. It's just under 500.
Yes. So your test has just handed out 500 positive results to people who do not have the disease. These are your false positives.
Now let's calculate the positive predictive value.
The formula for PPV is your true positives divided by all of your positive results combined, both true and false.
So that's 10 true positives divided by the total 510 positive results I got back from the lab. 10 divided by 510.
It's less than 2%.
Less than 2%.
There is the mathematical trap of screening. When a healthy person in your city gets a terrifying phone call saying their screening test is positive, there is actually a 98% chance that they are perfectly fine and it's a false positive.
Your healthcare system is now obligated to track down, counsel, and run expensive, potentially invasive confirmatory diagnostics on 500 panicked citizens.
Just to find the 10 who actually need help.
That would absolutely crush the resources of a local health authority.
It would break the system. And the textbook provides a brilliant, real-world clinical anchor for this exact phenomenon screening for beta thalassemia.
Let's look at that. The text outlines how we use a mean cell hemoglobin, or MCH, cutoff to screen individuals to see if they are carriers of the trait.
Yes, and if you set the MCH cutoff at 27 picograms, the test delivers 100% sensitivity. You will essentially never miss a single carrier.
And if you use that cutoff in a high prevalence setting, the text specifically mentioned certain hospital populations in London, the TCV is a very respectable 77.4%.
Meaning if the test is positive, there's a nearly 80% chance they're a carrier.
Right. But the moment you take that exact same test, utilizing that exact same 27 picogram cutoff, and deploy it in a low prevalence geographic area,
the math collapses. The positive predictive value plummets to an abysmal 1.3%.
just like our hypothetical example.
Exactly. The local health system in that low prevalence area will drown in false positives.
So how does a public health architect solve this? You can't just abandon screening.
No, you have to actively engineer a higher specificity. And the text shows how this is done.
How?
You can mandate a second sequential test. For example, if the MCH is low, you don't instantly call it a positive. You automatically run an HbA2 estimation to weed out the false positives.
Oh, that's smart.
Or if you are screening for maternal alpha-0 carriers, you tighten the parameters. You lower the MCH cutoff from 27 down to 25 picograms, and you mandate that it must be combined with a family origins questionnaire to assess baseline genetic risk.
And the systemic impact of making those adjustments to increase specificity must be staggering.
It is. The textbook notes that by refining those parameters, the Public Health Authority reduced the need for partner recall follow-ups by 96%.
The 96%.
Instead of having to desperately recall 1 in every 61 partners for further genetic testing, they only had to recall 1 in 1,497.
That single adjustment saves the laboratory infrastructure from collapse.
And it spares thousands of families from the sheer terror of an unexpected genetic recall.
That is the essence of systems thinking right there. You aren't just treating the blood in the vial.
No, you are engineering the flow of human beings through a massive bureaucratic and medical machine.
Which naturally leads us into the economics and the ethics of screening. We've established that sweeping the healthy population is logistically daunting. But how do we actually measure the cost? Because it's clearly not just the wholesale price of the swab or the chemical reagent used in the lab.
No, to measure the true cost, we have to look at opportunity costs. In a public health system, particularly a state-funded one, resources are finite. Every dollar, every nursing hour, every MRI slot dedicated to a population screening program is actively taken away from another part of the health system.
And we quantify this using metrics like quality-adjusted life years, or QEDALYs, and disability-adjusted life years, or DAILYs.
Exactly. We have to ask, are the QALYs gained by this screening program greater than the QALYs we are sacrificing by, say, underfunding pediatric asthma clinics or delaying elective hip replacements to pay for it?
And beyond the direct opportunity costs, there are the hidden structural system impacts.
Right, you can't just mail out tests. You need an entire IT infrastructure to track who has been invited, who ignored the letter, who needs a reminder.
You need a rigorous, independent quality assurance body to constantly monitor the laboratories to ensure their specificity doesn't drift over time.
And you have to build surgical and oncological capacity to handle the sudden influx of patients who require elective treatments because your screening program actually found something.
Let's look at how fragile these economic models can be over time. The textbook uses the abdominal aortic aneurysm, or AAA screening program, as a prime example.
It's a fascinating case. The original randomized controlled trials that proved AAA screening was cost-effective were conducted decades ago.
And at that time, smoking rates in the general male population were significantly higher.
Yes, and smoking is a massive risk factor for the development of an abdominal aortic aneurysm.
So the initial mathematical models were based on a population where the prevalence of the disease was relatively high.
Exactly. The trials demonstrated that screening saved lives at a reasonable cost per QLY, but years passed before the program was fully rolled out.
And during that time, completely separate public health initiatives like tobacco taxation and smoking bans were incredibly successful at driving down smoking rates.
Right, so by the time the AAA screening program was actually scanning people, the modern prevalence of the disease was much lower than the original trials predicted.
And because the prevalence dropped, the cost-effectiveness model was entirely thrown off.
Yes. You now have to scan vastly more men today to find a single dangerous aneurysm than you did 20 years ago. The cost per life saved skyrocketed.
That's a fascinating catch-22. A public health victory in tobacco control inadvertently made a public health screening program less economically viable.
It really did.
But let's say a screening program becomes wildly cost-ineffective, or worse, we discover it's actually causing net harm. Why is it so incredibly difficult to shut these programs down?
Oh, this brings us to a concept by Raffling Gray called the popularity paradox.
This is, frankly, one of the darkest, most counterintuitive psychological phenomena in all of medicine.
It is a stark warning for any public health official. It states that the more harm a screening program causes through overdiagnosis and overtreatment, the more popular that program becomes with the general public.
How is that logically possible? If I harm people, they should demand the program be dismantled.
It comes down to the nature of overdiagnosis. Imagine a screening program that aggressively detects microscopic, entirely benign abnormalities. Cellular changes that are so slow-growing, they would never have caused the patient a single symptom in their natural lifetime. The patient would have died of old age long before the abnormality became an issue.
That the screening program finds it.
Yes.
Oh.
The health system labels it a disease. The patient undergoes surgery or radiation to have it removed.
Oh. And because the abnormality was inherently benign, the treatment is 100% successful.
Exactly. The patient doesn't die. You have just manufactured an incredibly passionate, highly vocal survivor.
Wow.
That patient and their entire family genuinely believes that the screening program saved their life.
They will march on the Capitol, they will speak to the media, they'll form powerful advocacy groups demanding that the program be expanded.
Yes. You create an army of survivors whose survival was never actually in doubt.
It becomes politically impossible for a health minister to shut the program down.
Even if the epidemiological data clearly shows there has been zero reduction in population-level mortality.
To really grasp why mortality data can be so deceiving, we have to look at the statistical illusions that screening creates.
This is crucial.
The textbook highlights two major biases that every medical student needs to have permanently burned into their brain: length time bias and lead time bias.
Let's break these down, starting with length time bias.
Okay.
Length time bias is an illusion created by the biological behavior of different tumors. Let's imagine a specific type of cancer. In the real world, this cancer presents in two forms.
A and type B.
Let's call them that. Type A is highly aggressive. It grows rapidly, spreads quickly, and unfortunately kills the patient within 6 months of the first malignant cell forming.
Okay.
Type B is indolent. It grows at an incredibly slow, lazy pace. It might take 20 years to cause a problem.
Now, I introduce a population screening program. I'm going to scan the population every 3 years.
If you scan every 3 years, you are disproportionately going to detect the type B, slow-growing tumors, because they sit in the body for decades, waiting to be found. They have a long length of time in the detectable pre-symptomatic phase.
What happens to the aggressive type A tumors?
They usually rise, grow, and become symptomatic in the gaps between your 3-year screening rounds. The patient ends up in the emergency room with symptoms before their next scan is even due.
So my screening program essentially acts as a filter that only catches the biological slowpokes.
Exactly.
And when I publish the survival statistics for my screening program, I'm going to look like a genius doctor.
Because the patients detected by your screening program have a 95% survival rate.
But they don't have a high survival rate because my early intervention was brilliant. They have a high survival rate because I systematically only selected patients with non-lethal, slow-growing disease.
That is length time bias. You are selecting for less aggressive pathology.
Now let's contrast that with lead time bias.
Lead time bias is arguably even more deceptive because it creates the illusion of extended life without actually delaying death by a single day.
Let's use another hypothetical patient timeline. Patient X.
Okay. Patient X has a disease whose biological destiny is completely fixed. No matter what we do, this disease will kill patient X at exactly age 70.
Okay, sad but fixed.
In a world without screening, patient X lives a normal life until age 68 when they finally develop a symptom, maybe a persistent cough. They go to the doctor, they get diagnosed, and they live for 2 years before passing away at age 70.
So their survival time from the point of diagnosis is 2 years.
Right. Now introduce a screening program into patient X's life. The program detects the microscopic disease much earlier. They are screened and diagnosed at age 60.
But remember, the treatment isn't actually effective at altering the ultimate biological destiny of this specific disease.
Exactly. Patient X still dies at exactly age 70.
The date of death didn't move an inch.
But if I look at the statistics, patient X's survival time calculated from the date of diagnosis to the date of death just jumped from 2 years to 10 years.
And the Public Health Authority will issue a press release claiming their screening program increased survival times by 400%.
But in reality, all the screening program achieved was forcing patient X to live as a cancer patient, burdened with the psychological weight and potential toxicities of treatment for 8 additional years.
Without giving them a single extra day of actual life.
Right.
Keeping these profound biases and ethical traps in mind, let's take a chronological walkthrough of how screening is applied across the human lifespan.
The textbook outlines both the massive successes and the agonizing dilemmas, starting at the very beginning of life. Newborn and antenatal screening.
In the antenatal and immediate newborn period, we are sweeping for conditions like sickle cell disease, cystic fibrosis, and congenital hearing impairment.
And when we get this right, the benefits are immeasurable. Detecting hearing impairment early allows for interventions that fundamentally alter a child's linguistic and cognitive developmental trajectory.
And catching sickle cell early allows for prophylactic antibiotics that prevent lethal childhood infections.
But the textbook does not shy away from the ethical minefield this creates.
Right. The tests we use to find these diseases often incidentally uncover other genetic truths. For example, when testing for cystic fibrosis or sickle cell, we inevitably detect carrier status.
This creates a profound dilemma. You have tested a newborn and discovered they carry a recessive gene for a disease. It will not affect the child's own physical health. Do you disclose this to the parents?
The child is obviously unable to consent to knowing their genetic status.
You are burdening the parents with genetic information that only becomes relevant decades later when that child decides to reproduce.
And it gets even more complicated. When you are doing genetic screening on the infant and both parents, the laboratory will sometimes discover non-paternity. The genetic markers definitively prove that the assumed father in the waiting room is not the biological father of the child.
This is a devastating, life-altering piece of information discovered entirely by accident through a state-sponsored public health initiative.
It's an incidental finding that can destroy a family unit.
Which is exactly why the Wilson and Youngner criteria insist on public education, and why massive investments in pre- and post-test genetic counseling are mandatory. You cannot just hand someone a pamphlet and a positive result.
As we move from childhood into adulthood, the controversies don't fade, They just get more expensive.
Adult cancer screenings, specifically breast, cervical, and prostate, are multi-billion-dollar enterprises, and the raw numbers required to save a life are sobering.
Let's look at the textbook's data on cervical cancer screening. The impact of the pap smear and HPV testing has been historically massive in reducing incidence.
But look at the sheer volume of intervention required today. To prevent a single death from cervical cancer, a public health system must screen 1,000 women continuously for 35 years.
1,000 women returning every few years for 3.5 decades to save one life. And in the process of saving that one life, what is the systemic collateral damage?
Over that 35-year period, out of those 1,000 women, more than 150 will receive an abnormal result that causes severe acute anxiety.
Over 80 will be referred for invasive clinical investigation, like a colposcopy.
And over 50 women will undergo physical treatments, surgical excisions, or ablations for high-grade intraepithelial neoplasia.
And we know from the natural history of the disease that many of those dysplastic lesions would have naturally regressed and never progressed to invasive cancer.
We are overtreating 50 women to save one.
And then we hit the absolute lightning rod of public health debate, prostate cancer screening using the prostate-specific antigen, or PSA test.
Prostate cancer represents the ultimate collision of high prevalence, slow biological progression, and severe treatment morbidity. It is incredibly common in older men.
The classic epidemiological adage is that many more men die with prostate cancer than of it.
Autopsy studies routinely find microscopic prostate cancer in men who died of completely unrelated causes in their 80s and 90s.
So when we introduce widespread PSA testing, we trigger a massive wave of overdiagnosis. We find these microscopic indolent tumors.
But because we've labeled it cancer, patients understandably panic and demand action. This leads to biopsies, which carry a risk of sepsis, followed by radical prostatectomies or radiation.
And the side effects of those treatments, urinary incontinence and severe erectile dysfunction, permanently alter the patient's quality of life.
All to remove a tumor that likely never would have shortened their life.
Which brings us to the ultimate test of a public health system's integrity. When the evidence clearly shows that a screening program is doing more harm than good, how do you stop it?
You mentioned the popularity paradox earlier, where survivors defend the program. The textbook gives us a fascinating historical case study from Japan regarding neuroblastoma screening in infants.
This story blew my mind. Japan initiated a nationwide biochemical screening program for infant neuroblastoma, which is a type of pediatric tumor, in 1985.
They were looking for metabolites in the urine.
Right. Fast forward to 1990, just 5 years later, and an international panel of experts reviews the data. They conclude definitively that the screening is not reducing mortality.
And worse, it is causing active harm through the unnecessary surgical removal of benign, spontaneously regressing tumors.
The science was clear in 1990, yet the screening program continued for another 14 years. It wasn't until 2004 that a Japanese national committee officially recommended halting the program.
Why did it take 14 years to stop hurting children? If the evidence was there, shouldn't shutting it down be an overnight administrative order?
You would think.
It highlights the sheer bureaucratic inertia of established health programs. Once laboratories are built, funding is allocated, and clinical pathways are established, stopping the machine is incredibly difficult.
Interestingly, the textbook notes that the eventual shutdown in Japan in 2004 was successful largely because of what wasn't there.
Right. There were no entrenched patient advocacy groups aggressively pushing back, and the mainstream media decided to support the scientific committee's findings rather than sensationalizing the withdrawal of care.
It's a sobering lesson. Starting a screening program requires scientific evidence, but stopping one requires immense political bravery.
Well said.
I think this is the perfect moment for us to shift our overarching metaphor. Up to this point, we've been obsessing over the internal radar. We've been calculating how to protect the borders of the human body from threats growing on the inside.
But what happens when the threat isn't a slow-growing cluster of cells, but a rapidly mutating pathogen that is currently crossing an actual geopolitical border?
We need to fire up the global radar.
This is a massive conceptual leap. We are moving from the biostatistics of a single laboratory assay to the high-stakes world of international diplomacy and global health architecture.
If we accept the premise that disease does not respect national sovereignty, and history proves over and over that it doesn't, then we have to accept that our traditional political models are fundamentally broken when it comes to public health.
Let's talk about that traditional model. For centuries, international relations have been built on the Westphalian system.
For you listening, if you aren't familiar with political science terms, the Westphalian system essentially views every nation as a totally independent, isolated fortress.
The sovereign state has absolute control over everything that happens within its borders, and it has no right to interfere with what happens inside another state's borders.
In a world of horse-drawn carriages, the Westphalian fortress somewhat worked.
But in an era of ultra-rapid globalization, where supply chains, capital, and millions of people cross borders every single day, the fortress is obsolete.
A novel respiratory virus incubating in a rural farming village on Tuesday can be walking through the international terminal of a major global metropolis on Wednesday.
This reality is what birthed the necessity for global health governance, or GHG.
GHG is the messy, complex web of formal institutions like the WHO, alongside informal rules, philanthropic foundations, and global partnerships that try to manage these cross-border health threats.
And to really decode Chapter 3.8 of the textbook, we need to master a crucial conceptual differentiation. We need to split the idea of governance into two distinct actions: governance of health and governance for health.
This distinction is paramount. Let's start with governance of health. This is what most people picture when they think of global health.
It refers to the direct, explicit management of health-specific issues by health-specific actors. For example, when the World Health Assembly gathers in Geneva and passes a resolution specifically aimed at polio eradication or managing malaria bed net distribution.
It is doctors and health ministers doing health things.
But governance for health is a much broader, much more difficult geopolitical strategy.
It is. Governance for health is fundamentally an advocacy and policy function. It's the realization that the health sector alone cannot protect the public.
So global health actors attempt to influence the governance of entirely different non-health sectors like international trade, agriculture, energy, or environmental policy.
The goal is to force those other sectors to explicitly include human health as a primary objective in their own policymaking.
So governance for health is public health experts knocking on the doors of the World Trade Organization or the UN Environment Program and saying, hey, we know you're trying to regulate global shipping lanes or coal emissions, but you need to understand how this is going to impact pediatric asthma rates in coastal cities.
Exactly. It's the operationalization of health in all policies on a global scale.
You cannot ensure the health of a population simply by building more hospitals. You have to regulate the environmental toxins and the food supply chains that are putting people in the hospital in the first place.
As we look at the machinery that makes this global governance possible, we keep running into an economic term in the textbook, the global public good, or GPG.
Before we apply this to health, what exactly does a traditional economist mean when they call something a public good?
In classic economic theory, a public good must possess two very specific, rigid characteristics. First, it must be non-rival in consumption.
This means that if I consume the good, it does not diminish your ability to consume the exact same good. My use doesn't use it up.
Second, it must be non-excludable. This means it is physically or practically impossible to prevent someone from accessing or using the good, even if they didn't pay for it.
The classic textbook analogy for this is street lighting.
If I'm walking down the street at night, my eyes, using the light from the street lamp, doesn't leave any less light for you walking 10 paces behind me. It's non-rival.
And the city council can't realistically put a toll booth on the sidewalk to prevent non-taxpayers from seeing the light. It's non-excludable.
So let's take that strict economic framework and apply it to our field. Is health a global public good?
It's a highly debated topic, but generally yes, especially when we view health as a positive sum game.
If I live in a community that is free from a highly transmissible infectious disease, let's say we've achieved herd immunity for measles, my good health directly benefits you.
My lack of disease reduces your risk of exposure. My health does not rival yours. It enhances it.
And if the entire community is protected, you cannot easily exclude a visiting stranger from experiencing the safety of that herd immunity.
But the textbook asks us to be more granular. It differentiates between a final GPG and an intermediate GPG.
Right. A final GPG is the ultimate tangible outcome we are striving for. For instance, a global ecosystem entirely free from pandemic influenza, or the total eradication of smallpox.
The eradication of smallpox is the ultimate final GPG. Every human on Earth benefits from it, and no one can be excluded from a smallpox-free world.
But you don't just snap your fingers and get a smallpox-free world. You need mechanisms, and that's where the intermediate GPG comes in.
Exactly. An intermediate GPG is the diplomatic or regulatory tool that helps us achieve the final outcome. It's the international treaty, the global surveillance network, or the shared vaccine stockpile. It's the architecture that makes the outcome possible.
And that brings us to the absolute heaviest tools in the global health governance toolbox. We're talking about hard law.
In international relations, hard law refers to legally binding international treaties that states sign and ratify, surrendering a small piece of their Westphalian sovereignty to abide by shared rules.
And perhaps the most prominent, groundbreaking example of hard law in the history of public health is the WHO FCTC, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control.
The FCTC is a monumental achievement. Prior to this, international treaties were generally reserved for things like nuclear arms reduction, human rights, or chemical weapons.
The FCTC represents the first time the world came together to create a legally binding global treaty aimed at suppressing a specific, legally sold consumer product.
I want to dig into how this actually happened, because we've known tobacco causes lung cancer since the mid-20th century. The epidemiology was rock solid for decades. Why did it take until the early 2000s to actually get a treaty? Wasn't the death toll enough to spur global action?
Historically, no, the death toll wasn't enough. The tobacco industry was incredibly powerful, deeply embedded in national economies, and highly skilled at lobbying and obscuring the science.
The catalyst for the FCTC wasn't just epidemiology, it was a massive legal breakthrough. In the late 1990s, massive state-level litigation in the United States forced the tobacco industry into a settlement.
As part of that settlement, the industry was forced to publicly release millions of pages of internal, highly classified corporate documents.
The textbook mentions this. It was over 35 million pages of secret documents dumped into the public domain.
And those documents were a smoking gun, no pun intended. They provided undeniable written proof of the industry's deliberate strategies to engineer addiction, to specifically market their products to vulnerable youth, and to actively fund pseudoscience to cast doubt on the links between smoking and cancer.
It wasn't just a health issue anymore, it was a revelation of corporate malfeasance on a global scale.
This fueled unprecedented international outrage and provided the political momentum the WHO needed to push through a binding treaty against fierce industry lobbying.
Let's look at the actual architecture of the FCTC, because it is a masterclass in applying governance of and F4 health simultaneously. The treaty divides its interventions into two broad categories: price measures and non-price measures.
The textbook heavily emphasizes the raw power of price measures, specifically aggressive taxation.
Taxation is arguably the single most effective public health intervention for tobacco. The economic models are striking. As you increase the price of a pack of cigarettes, consumption predictably drops.
Particularly among youth and low-income populations who are the most price-sensitive.
In low and middle-income countries, the cost-effectiveness ratio of implementing tobacco taxes is astounding. It costs roughly $3 to $42 to avert one disability-adjusted life year. You are saving years of healthy life for the cost of a cup of coffee.
But the tobacco lobby always pushes back on taxation with a specific economic threat. They tell finance ministers, if you raise taxes, consumption will drop so fast that you will lose massive amounts of tax revenue and your national budget will suffer.
It's a common threat, but the economic data disproves it. Raising tobacco taxes consistently increases total government revenue.
Why?
Because tobacco is highly addictive. The drop in the volume of sales happens at a slower rate than the increase in the tax margin per pack.
So fewer people are smoking, public health improves, and the Treasury actually collects more money, which can ideally be reinvested into the health system.
Alongside taxation, the FCTC mandates sweeping non-price measures. These include comprehensive blanket bans on all tobacco advertising, promotion, and sports sponsorship.
It also mandates the use of large graphic health warnings on the packaging itself, stripping away the glamorous branding.
But the FCTC architects knew that individual national laws weren't enough. If country A raises taxes massively and neighboring country B keeps cigarettes cheap, you instantly create a black market.
Smugglers will just move cheap cigarettes across the border, undermining country A's public health goals.
Which proves the absolute necessity of the global radar. You cannot control a transnational corporation strictly within a single border.
This is why the FCTC includes the protocol to eliminate illicit trade in tobacco products. It forces countries to cooperate on customs enforcement, tracking, and tracing.
The FCTC is the ultimate intermediate global public good.
The other massive pillar of hard law and global health is the international health regulations, specifically the sweeping revisions made in 2005, universally referred to as IHR 2005.
This is a legally binding agreement ratified by 196 state parties. If the FCTC is the rulebook for a slow-moving epidemic like tobacco, the IHR is the emergency operating manual for global outbreak response.
But reading through the core purpose of the IHR, it's a very delicate, almost contradictory balancing act. The stated aim is to prevent, protect against, and control the international spread of disease.
But it specifically mandates that this must be done in ways that avoid unnecessary interference with international traffic and trade.
I can imagine a skeptical public health trainee reading that and thinking, wait, that sounds like we were prioritizing corporate shipping routes and airline profits over stopping a lethal virus. Why is that clause in there?
It sounds cynical, but it's actually a deeply pragmatic public health strategy. Put yourself in the shoes of a health minister in a developing nation. Your surveillance team has just identified a cluster of a highly lethal novel respiratory virus in your capital city.
Under the IHR, you are obligated to report this to the WHO immediately.
But if you report it, and the immediate global reaction is that every other country slams their borders shut, bans your exports, cancels all flights, and utterly destroys your national economy overnight, you have a massive disincentive to report the next outbreak.
Exactly. If the punishment for transparency is economic annihilation, countries will simply hide their outbreaks until they are too massive to conceal, and by then, the virus is already spread globally.
The IHR attempts to strike a balance. It demands transparency, but it also tries to restrain other nations from implementing panicked, unscientific travel and trade bans that penalize the reporting country.
To make this system function, the IHR 2005 requires all 196 member states to develop and maintain 8 core capacities. These aren't suggestions, they are binding obligations.
Countries must have functional local surveillance, the ability to rapidly respond to a localized outbreak, trained human resources, and robust laboratory services capable of identifying novel pathogens.
And the ultimate alarm bell within this system is the declaration of a PHEIC, a public health emergency of international concern. The WHO Director General has the sole authority to declare a PHEIC.
The first major test of this newly revised system came during the 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemic.
And according to the textbook, the post-pandemic review of the IHR's performance during H1N1 was a mixed bag. The regulations certainly helped coordinate the global response and provided a framework for information sharing.
But the glaring failure was that many countries had simply failed to build those 8 core capacities. They signed the treaty, but they didn't fund the laboratories or train the epidemiologists.
Which highlights the fundamental weakness of international hard law enforcement. The WHO doesn't have an international police force. If a sovereign state fails to build a laboratory, the WHO cannot arrest the health minister.
The system relies heavily on peer pressure, diplomatic naming and shaming, and mutual self-interest.
So if hard law treaties take decades to negotiate, require massive political capital, and are incredibly difficult to enforce, what do we do when we urgently need global cooperation, but we can't get 196 countries to sign a binding treaty? Are we just paralyzed?
Not at all. This is where the brilliant flexibility of soft law becomes vital to the global radar. Soft law refers to international agreements, voluntary guidelines, standards, and normative frameworks. They are not legally binding in their original form.
I'll play the skeptic again. If a rule is completely voluntary and there is no legal penalty for breaking it, why would a sovereign nation or a multinational corporation ever bother to follow it?
Because soft law exerts immense economic and diplomatic gravity. Its power lies precisely in its flexibility. It allows nations to cooperate, share information, and harmonize their internal standards without feeling that their sacred Westphalian autonomy is being legally threatened by bureaucrats in Geneva.
The textbook uses the domain of food safety as a masterclass in how soft law operates.
Food safety is the perfect example of a transboundary threat. We live in an era of hyper-globalized supply chains.
A single batch of contaminated baby corn grown in one hemisphere can be processed, packaged, and shipped, causing a massive shigellosis or salmonella outbreak in 3 different countries on another continent within days.
The economic burden of foodborne illnesses, from bacterial outbreaks to chemical contamination like the melamine milk scandal, is staggering.
To manage this chaos, the international community relies on the Codex Alimentarius Commission. This was jointly established by the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, and the WHO.
The Codex is essentially a massive, constantly evolving encyclopedia of voluntary international food safety standards, guidelines, and codes of practice.
But here is the genius mechanism of how soft law hardens. The Codex standards are technically voluntary. But as the textbook points out, they have immense de facto legal power because they become legally binding the moment an individual sovereign nation incorporates those Codex standards into their own domestic legislation.
And even more powerfully, the World Trade Organization, the WTO, officially recognizes the Codex standards as the ultimate international benchmark when settling trade disputes.
Explain how that works in practice.
Let's say country A wants to export tons of beef to country B. Country B refuses to accept the beef, claiming it doesn't meet their safety standards. Country A files a massive lawsuit at the WTO, claiming Country B is just using fake safety concerns as a protectionist tariff to protect their own local farmers.
The WTO will look at the case and ask, does Country A's beef meet the voluntary Codex Alimentarius standards?
If it does, Country B is legally forced by the WTO to accept the trade or face massive financial sanctions.
So if you want to participate in the lucrative global agricultural market, you essentially have to follow the Codex, even if it's technically soft law. It's voluntary in name, but mandatory in practice if you want to make money.
Alongside the Codex, the Global Radar also relies on InfoSam, the International Food Safety Authorities Network. This is the rapid emergency communication network that lights up when a contamination event occurs, allowing countries to rapidly recall products before people die.
Another absolutely brilliant example of soft law, one that resolved a terrifying diplomatic crisis, is the PIP framework, which stands for Pandemic Influenza Preparedness.
This is one of the most dramatic stories in global health, and it entirely revolves around the tension between global security and national sovereignty. It stems from a massive crisis in 2007 involving the highly lethal H5N1 avian influenza virus.
Up until 2007, the global system for monitoring influenza relied on a gentleman's agreement. Countries would swab infected patients, isolate the novel influenza viruses, and voluntarily share those physical biological samples with the WHO's global network of collaborating laboratories.
This allowed the WHO to track mutations and, crucially, to share those viruses with pharmaceutical manufacturers so they could begin developing candidate vaccines.
But in 2007, developing nations, led prominently by Indonesia, essentially rebelled against the entire system. They realized a brutal inequity. They were freely sharing their sovereign biological resources, the virus samples isolated from their own citizens.
The WHO was handing those samples to massive private pharmaceutical corporations located in wealthy Western nations. Those corporations were developing vaccines, patenting them, and planning to sell them at high market prices.
The developing nations realized that if a true pandemic hit, they would be at the back of the line. They would not be able to afford the very vaccines that were created using their own biological materials. It was viewed as a form of biological colonialism.
So what do? They went on strike, they stopped sharing the viruses, they withheld the physical samples from the WHO.
And this terrified the global health security establishment. Because if the WHO cannot see the virus mutating in real time in Southeast Asia or Africa, the global radar goes completely blind. The world cannot prepare a vaccine.
It forced a massive, tense diplomatic negotiation between sovereign states, the WHO, and the private pharmaceutical industry.
The breakthrough that resolved the crisis was the PIP framework. And the core of this framework was establishing the equal footing principle. The framework explicitly declared that the sharing of viruses by member states and the sharing of the resulting benefits like access to vaccines, antivirals, and diagnostic kits are equally important obligations.
You cannot have one without the other.
To enforce this without creating a full hard law treaty, they utilized a novel legal mechanism. They created legally binding contracts called SMTA2s, or Standard Material Transfer Agreements.
If a private pharmaceutical company or academic lab wants to receive a virus sample from the WHO network, they must sign an SMTA2. This contract legally binds the company to commit to benefit sharing, for instance, pledging to donate a certain percentage of their future vaccine production to the WHO for use in developing nations during a pandemic.
And it didn't stop there. The framework also established a partnership contribution mechanism. This requires the vaccine and pharmaceutical manufacturers who utilize the WHO network to pay an annual collective financial contribution.
The WHO then uses those millions of dollars to actively build a laboratory and surveillance capacity in developing nations, ensuring the global radar remains strong everywhere. It is a phenomenal example of negotiated cooperation. It's not a perfect system, but it bridged a divide that threatened to derail global pandemic preparedness.
And finally, as we bring our conceptual models together, we have to look at multisectoral action. We've talked about governance for health influencing other sectors. How does public health actually integrate with entirely different fields like environmental protection?
The textbook's prime example here is the Minamata Convention on Mercury. For clinical context, mercury is a severe systemic neurotoxin. It causes devastating neurological damage, especially to developing fetuses. Much of the global mercury pollution is released from industrial processes, coal burning, and highly dangerous, unregulated, small-scale gold mining operations.
The Minamata Convention is an environmental treaty. It was spearheaded and led by the UN Environment Program, UNEP. It is not fundamentally a WHO document. But the WHO was invited to the table to provide crucial health expertise during the negotiations.
And their presence changed the DNA of the treaty. The WHO ensured that the treaty didn't just focus on the chemistry of environmental emissions, but explicitly included chapters dedicated to the protection of human health. They advocated for the phase-out of mercury in medical instruments like old thermometers and sphygmomanometers, and they fought for protections for the vulnerable populations engaged in that small-scale gold mining.
It is the perfect, tangible illustration of health in all policies. It proves that to truly protect human health in the modern world, public health practitioners cannot just stay in the clinic or the laboratory. They must be diplomats. They must have a seat at the table when environmental, agricultural, and international trade laws are being drafted.
Let's unpack everything we've covered as we bring this deep dive to a close. We have journeyed a massive conceptual distance today. We started by agonizing over the mathematical consequences of a single false positive blood test for a single healthy patient, and we scaled all the way up to the tense diplomatic negotiations of United Nations treaties.
As you close your textbook and prepare to return to the wards, the clinic, or your public health seminars, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought. We are moving at breakneck speed into an era of ultra-rapid, frictionless globalization. Simultaneously, we're entering the age of personalized, hyper-specific genetic screening. Artificial intelligence and algorithms are beginning to predict our individual health futures with terrifying precision, while climate change accelerates the transboundary movement of novel, unpredictable pathogens.
The traditional lines that separate individual health privacy, national borders, and global biosecurity are blurring faster than our current legal frameworks can handle.
So the question is, will traditional Westphalian national sovereignty over public health eventually become entirely obsolete? When the next pandemic hits, will the world be forced to abandon the polite, negotiated cooperation of soft law and create a fully integrated, authoritative planetary health system with the power to enforce its mandates? It's something heavy to mull over as you think about the future landscape of your profession.
It is a profound, unsettled question. And I want to remind you that the frameworks we have discussed today, from the harsh mathematical reality of positive predictive value to the economic criteria defining global public goods, are not just abstract concepts designed to pass an exam. They are the actual practical tools you will use to evaluate, critique, and hopefully improve the systems you work in every single day.
Exactly. This deep dive is designed to be a companion to your reading, not a replacement. We strongly encourage you to actively apply these frameworks to your daily practice. But before we let you go, let's lock in what we've learned today. We're going to run through some rapid-fire, single best answer style prompts. I'll read the question, pause for a moment so you can think of the answer, and then the expert will give you the solution and tell you exactly where in the Oxford textbook you can review it. Ready? Let's dive in. A new screening test for a rare disease has 99% sensitivity and 99% specificity. However, the prevalence of the disease in the population is only 0.1%. Will the positive predictive value be high or low?
The answer is low. Because the prevalence is so low, the absolute number of false positives will drastically outnumber the true positives, resulting in a low PPV of around 9%. Review Section 11.4 on the properties of screening tests.
In cancer screening, what type of bias occurs when early detection makes survival time appear longer, even if the actual progression of the disease and time of death remain unchanged?
That is lead time bias. You can consolidate this concept by reviewing Section 11.4 under cancer screening in adults.
What is the key epidemiological distinction between screening and case finding, or opportunistic testing?
Screening is systematically offered to a defined population of asymptomatic individuals, whereas testing or case finding is applied opportunistically to patients who have already sought medical care or are known to be at risk. Review the concepts in screening in Section 11.4.
In global health architecture, what is the term for advocating and influencing other sectors, such as agriculture, trade, or the environment, to include health as an explicit policy objective?
This is known as governance for our health, as opposed to governance of health. Revisit the introduction to global health governance in section 3.8.
From an economic perspective, health is often considered a global public good. What are the two defining characteristics of a public good?
It must be non-rival in consumption, meaning one person's use doesn't impede another's, and non-excludable, meaning you cannot prevent someone from consuming it. Review the Global Public Goods section in Chapter 3.8.
The International Health Regulations, or IHR 2005, represent binding hard law. What is the central balancing act the IHR attempts to maintain during an outbreak?
The IHR aims to protect against the international spread of disease while avoiding unnecessary interference with international traffic and trade. Consolidate this by reviewing the IHR case study in Section 3.8.
Under the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness, or PIP framework, a major diplomatic breakthrough occurred in 2007 regarding the sharing of viruses. What principle was placed on an equal footing with virus sharing?
Benefit sharing. The framework ensures that access to vaccines and other benefits is prioritized for developing countries, regardless of their virus sharing levels. Review the PIP framework case study in Section 3.8.
Are the standards set by the Codex Alimentarius Commission considered legally binding hard law upon their creation?
No. They are voluntary soft law and only become binding when individual member states convert them into national legislation. Review the Food Safety and Codex case study in Section 3.8.
That's it for our review. Keep applying these frameworks, and we'll see you on the next deep dive. Here are the details of this episode.
International efforts to promote public health. Byline: Health Without Borders Cooperation in an Interdependent World. Episode description: Disease does not respect sovereignty. Trade, travel, migration, climate change, and conflict interlink the health of nations. This chapter examines the architecture of global public health governance. It explores the roles of multilateral organizations, bilateral agencies, philanthropic foundations, and global partnerships in shaping health outcomes worldwide.
The World Health Organization and its normative leadership. The International Health Regulations. Global health financing mechanisms. The rise of public-private partnerships. The influence of large philanthropic actors, multi-sectoral initiatives targeting infectious diseases and non-communicable conditions. The chapter also addresses the politics of global health power asymmetries, donor priorities, geopolitical tensions, and debates over sovereignty versus collective security. Globalization has accelerated both risk and response. Emerging infections, antimicrobial resistance, climate change, and pandemic preparedness require coordinated action. Yet international collaboration is not purely technical. It is shaped by diplomacy, economic interests, and historical inequalities. The chapter ultimately frames global public health as a system of negotiated cooperation, imperfect, evolving, and essential. Public health at the international level becomes both science and diplomacy. Key takeaways. Global health governance involves multiple international actors. WHO provides normative leadership but operates within political constraints. The International Health Regulations structure outbreak response. Global financing mechanisms influence national priorities. Power imbalances shape global health agendas. Emerging threats demand coordinated action. Diplomacy and health security are intertwined. International collaboration is essential, but politically complex.